So, yun. So, good day everyone. So, again, I'm your professor for ACC 204. I'm Arnold Malibiran. And for today's video lecture, I will be discussing the overview on the accounting for manufacturing overhead costs. Ayan. So, for today, I will be discussing about the normal costing. Ayan. So, we'll revisit yung normal costing concept natin. And yun, i-compare natin siya ulit for this particular discussion sa actual costing natin. Ayan. And as we go along with our discussion, yun, I posted a material related to this particular topic. And so you can use that material na lang para masabayan nyo yung magiging discussion ko for this video. Ayan. So, yun, make sure na you recall yung mga concept no ng job order natin, accounting for materials and even for the labor kasi lahat ng topics na na-touch natin na yun might be relevant in understanding the nature of the manufacturing overhead costs natin. And to start with, allow me to recall lang, no? Ano bang meron kay manufacturing overhead costs? Yan. I'm pretty sure you're very familiar with the concept of the manufacturing overhead costs, that these are the indirect labor natin and indirect material costs natin, which could not be directly be traceable to a certain job. Yan. So, in most manufacturing companies, ito yung isa sa malaking challenge in setting the product costs nila. Kasi, yun nga, hindi traceable yung costs. At the same time, kapag masyadong voluminous na yung transaction and kapag masyado na malalaki yung costs, ang hirap na niyang i-allocate to a certain job. Yan. And ang hirap na din i-monitor kung lahat ba ng nakikita nilang cost is properly accounted for or kung tama bang na allocate nila yon sa certain product nila and consider sa pagpa-product costing nila. So, to name a few, some of the example lang no, na mga overhead cost natin yan. So, for the indirect materials, usually ito yung mga materials na hindi natin makikita directly sa mismong product. Katulad ng mga supplies natin, yan. Yung mga lubricants, yan. Yung mga pinandikit lang para makakreate tayo ng certain output, yan. Yung mga super maliliit na tools, yan. Katulad ng mga certain na pako, ayan. So, depende sa treatment ng company. Kasi, for example, sa nails, there are some companies na tinitreat si nails as part ng direct materials nila. So, normally, depende na din talaga siya sa practice ng industry at saka kung ano yung policy ng company. Yan. So, katulad na lang ng mga engineering materials natin. Ayan. So, yun nga, katulad nga ng mga pako. Kasi, in parang lalo na yung mga multinational manufacturing companies, yung nagiging practice nila for yung mga maliliit lang talaga na engineering materials, ang ginagawa nila, tinitreat na lang as supplies. And normally kapag supplies naman, hindi siya part ng product costs natin. Yan. Or for some companies, they could monitor or they could, parang kaya pa nilang i-monitor na magkaroon sila ng separate inventory monitoring for the supplies. Yan. Pero most cases, outright expense na siya. So parang nagkakaroon na lang ng supplies inventory kapag masyado malaki yung on hand nila na supplies sa end ng month or sa end ng period. Ayan. And yun. For the indirect labor naman, ito yung mga workers natin or mga employee ng isang company na working indirectly para magkaroon tayo ng complete product. Ayan. And yung mga example natin dito, yung mga supervisors ng manufacturing, yung mga production facility natin, ayan. Even yung mga clerical workers natin, and yung mga payroll clerks natin na nagpa-process ng payout for the factory workers. Ayan. So, included sila sa indirect labor natin. And yun, katulad na lang din ng mga clerks natin sa mga logistics department natin and even the supervisors ng mga warehouses. Ayan. So, part sila ng indirect labor natin. And even the overtime premium, ayan. So, I think na-mention naman tong part na to dun sa labor part, labor, accounting for labor discussion natin na yun, there are some cases na yung overtime premium is treated as an overhead account. Yeah. And yung other manufacturing overhead natin, yan. Siguro for this one, di ko na siya isa-isahin, no? Na-recall ko lang yung isang question in our first quiz yata yon, yung about sa isang fixed cost related to, parang may list ng mga overhead costs, alin yung fixed, alin yung variable. Ayan. So, parang madami kasing nagkamali doon. I think mga 80% of my students nagkamali doon sa particular question na yon. Ayan, so be mindful na lang kayo, no? Halimbawa, for the depreciation expense. So, kapag depreciation expense yan, hindi naman siya laging fixed, hindi naman siya laging variable. Depende sa method of the depreciation. Yan. So, pag mga contract-based, usually fixed cost yan. Katulad ng mga repairs na contract-based. Yan. Usually kasi kapag ang revenue recognition natin is based on contract, may specific costs na ginagamit to contracts. Kaya fixed cost siya kapag may supporting contract tayo. Ayan. And yun, for the controls naman of the manufacturing overhead costs, normally, ayun, ang difficulty talaga is tracking the flow ng costs natin for the overhead. Kaya ang nangyayari dyan, kaya nag-conceptualize yung normal costing natin. Kasi if you can recall yung normal costing natin, we are making estimates to determine the total overhead costs of the company. Yan. The way we do the estimates, so nag-create tayo ng predetermined overhead rate, kung saan ba yung magiging valuation basis natin for the overhead costs. Yan. And yun, kasi if we are going to wait for the actual overhead costs, ang nagiging impact kasi niyan sa company would be the timeliness ng budgeting. Yan. So normally kasi ang budgeting ng isang company is done sa start ng period or kung annual budget to normally. Siyempre, before mag-start yung year, dapat may naset ng budget. Yan. Kasi based on the budget, there will be an allocation of resources per department. Yan. Particularly for government, no? Kasi we have appropriations of funds kapag government naman yung involved. Pero kapag mga private practice to, ayan. So, actually, we have a specific position available for those personnel creating the budget. Yan. Normally, itong mga budgets natin, ito yung mga high-level budgets na parang per each account na mini-maintain ng company, they are parang assessing kung, halimbawa, for certain operations ng company, yung budget nila yung magde-determine if they're going to continue the operation or not. Yan. Halimbawa, katulad din dito yung mga operating segments natin, yan, sa actual practice. Wherein, there are some companies na dinidivide into segments yung company nila, and per each segment, magkakaiba ng product line yan. And if hindi nakikita na nilang hindi ganong profitable na i-manufacture pa yung certain product na yon kasi ang laki ng ma-attribute or malaki yung ma-estimate nilang budget for the overhead, probably they are going to discontinue that specific segment and they will focus on the part na ng segment na profitable for the company. So, very relevant in management decision yung concept ng controls natin for the overhead. Yan. And for this particular discussion, allow me to share lang din sa inyo class yung mga iba't ibang ways on how we can determine the overhead rate. Ayan. And yun, normally yung mga overhead rate basis natin would be the following. First, based on the cost of the direct labor hours, direct material costs, machine hours, and units of production. And normally, yung pag-select kung ano yung maging basis for the predetermined overhead rate natin, based siya sa decision ng management. Ayan. And based na din siya sa industry ng company. Kasi halimbawa yung mga for example, mga construction companies natin, ayan. So kung construction company, there are some construction company na mas malaki yung naaalat nilang costs for the direct labor kaysa dun sa naaalat nilang cost for the materials ng company. If mas malaki yung volume or percentage nung naaalat na costs for the labor, yan, better for them to create a more conservative predetermined overhead rate based on the direct labor costs. Yan. And yun, may mga companies naman na very in particular sa mga materials usage ng mga projects nila. And if ganun yung situation, syempre mas magandang decision ng management to select direct materials as their basis for the computation of their overhead rate. Yan. If their cost accumulation process would be based on a normal costing setup. Pero if ang pag-uusapan naman natin dito is actual costing, yan, wala naman tayong magiging requirement for the computation of the overhead rate. I mean, for the predetermined overhead rate. Yan. Ayun. So, for us to see how we compute for the overhead rate basis, so first, let's take a look at this illustration. Ayan. So, for this particular illustration, so given yung mga overhead given yung total overhead cost natin, and we'll compute ano ba yung naging predetermined overhead rate natin. Ayan. And yun, ito yung mga other given pa, the units of production, the direct material costs, machine hours, direct labor hours, and the direct labor costs. So, assuming na yung naging selection ng management is to use direct labor costs as their valuation basis for the computation of the predetermined overhead rate. Yan. So, if magiging direct labor cost yung basis ng management natin, so ito yung magiging formula natin in computing the predetermined overhead rate natin. Yan. So, very important na we'll know kung ano yung total overhead costs natin para ma-compute natin yung predetermined overhead rate natin. Yan. So, to interpret this formula, so, i-remember nyo lang no, na laging numerator natin yung manufacturing overhead costs natin. Yan. And denominator natin usually kung ano yung parang cost driver natin or napagbabasihan ng cost or yung pagbabasihan ng predetermined overhead rate natin. Ayan. So, yun. So, given na ito yung formula, manufacturing overhead costs divided by direct labor costs. So, we'll have 96,000 divided by 200,000. And yung magiging answer natin would be a result of getting the percentage of the direct labor costs. Yan. So, if we are going to interpret this predetermined overhead rate, it would mean that, for example, yung certain job would incur 6,000 pesos na direct labor costs. Yan. It would mean na 48% of that total direct labor costs would be our applied overhead costs. Ayan. And yun, remember nyo yung term about the applied overhead. Yan. So, kasi yung applied overhead, applicable lang siya for normal costing. Wherein we multiply the predetermined overhead rate times the basis for the overhead rate. Yan. Okay. And the next basis naman, if direct labor hour basis naman siya. Ayan. So, kung direct labor hour basis siya, so yung magiging denominator natin would be the direct labor hours. And yung mako-compute natin na rate would be per direct labor hour. So, still 96,000 yung numerator natin, which is the total manufacturing overhead costs. And yung direct labor hours natin based on the illustration natin is 40,000 hours. Yan. That's why we came up with 2.4 pesos per direct labor hour. Yan. So, if we are going to interpret this, ayan, so use this as reference. So, if a certain job would require us na 2,250 daw yung kailangan direct labor hours para ma-complete. And for us to compute for the applied overhead costs, we need to multiply our predetermined rate na 2.4 per direct labor hour times the number of direct hours na na-allot to a certain job. Ayan. So yun, still related pa din siya in our job order costing setup kasi it forms part pa din ng job cost sheet natin. Yan. Okay, so if direct material naman yung cost ng basis natin, so yung denominator natin would be the total direct material costs. And yung answer na makukuha natin we could have the percentage of material costs. Yan. So, using the same illustration above, no? Yan, ito. So, the direct material cost natin is amounting to 480,000 pesos. And by dividing it to our total manufacturing overhead costs na 96,000, we'll have 20% of direct material costs. Yan. So, it would mean that for a certain job, yan, if 22,000 yung mai-spend natin na mga direct materials sa isang job, it would mean that 20% of it is our applied overhead costs. Yan. And yun, if ang tanong sa certain problems natin would be magkano yung total costs allotted to the job, yan, or total work in process of job letter A, ayan. So, ito total nyo lang yung direct labor, direct materials, saka yung na-compute nyo na overhead cost. Ayan. And then, there are some basis pa such as yung machine hours basis natin kapag ang best example for the machine hours basis kapag yung production facility natin mostly less yung labor or human intervention in the completion of the certain production or job. Yan. Magandang example dito, naalala ko lang, no? Like si Gardenia. Ayan. If naka-visit na kayo sa manufacturing plant ng Gardenia, totally yung pag-manufacture ng bread, yan, the packaging of the bread, sa case ng Gardenia, halos wala siyang human intervention. Siguro pag move na lang ng mga ilang box, yan, pag-load sa mga trucks, yan, yun na lang yung nagiging human intervention ng direct labor costs natin. Yan. Pero actually, nagiging indirect labor cost na ngayon kung titingnan natin. Kasi hindi naman talaga related na yung personnel in creating the bread. Yan. Mostly high on the machine usage. That's why may basis tayo na we could rely on the machine hours as basis for the computation of the predetermined overhead rate. Yan. Yun, so kung gano'n naman yung basis again, so yung cost driver natin would be the machine hours. Yan. Kaya siya yung magiging nasa denominator natin. And yung makakompute natin na rate would be a rate per machine hour. Yan. And yun, kung titingnan natin yung illustration kanina, still the manufacturing overhead costs is amounting to 96,000. And the machine hours for this particular illustration is 12,000 hours. Yan. That's why we'll came up with 8 pesos per machine hour. So meaning if a certain job would require us to have or to allot 400 machine hours, so yung mako-compute natin na applied overhead cost would be 400 times 8, which is 3,200. Yan. And kapag naman based on the output or on the production, yung magiging valuation natin for the predetermined overhead rate. So, ito yung magiging computation natin for that. So, manufacturing overhead costs divided by the units of production, wherein we could get the overhead costs per unit of production. So, yung rate na mako-compute natin dito, yun yung ita-times natin sa certain output ng isang job for us to compute for the total applied overhead costs. Yan. So using the same illustration, ayan, so overhead cost is 96,000. Total output is, yan, 24,000 units. Yan. And yun, to get the predetermined overhead rate, we'll divide this 24,000 units to 96,000 and we'll have 4 pesos per unit of production as a predetermined overhead rate natin. And if a certain job would require or will produce 1,200 units. So our total applied overhead cost would be amounting to 4,800. Yan. So yun. Actually, yun yung summary or parang yung gist talaga for today's lecture. Pero for your reference na lang din, and why is it so important to annualize our overhead application rate? Ayan, so I've shared naman kanina no, the concept of budgeting ng most manufacturing companies. And yun, kaya nagkakaroon talaga ng annualization ng overhead rate natin kasi it would be best for the company to create the budget before the period. Yan. And normally yung budget natin, particularly kung publicly listed yung companies, naka-annualize talaga siya. Yan. And another reasons why we need to annualize the overhead application rate. So first is to overcome fluctuations on the computed unit cost due to changes in the level of volume. Yan. So if there is changes in the productivity, yan. So nagkakaroon tayo ng fluctuations din on the actual overhead. That's why very important to annualize it. And then another factor bakit kailangan nating i-annualize yung overhead application rate natin or bakit mas beneficial siya for management is to overcome the fluctuations naman in the computed unit costs due to seasonal calendar. Ayan, particularly like yung mga halimbawa, pasta. Ayan, very in demand ang pasta kapag may special occasions. Ayan, katulad ng bare months natin. Ayan. So, mas malaki yung possible na ma-incur na overhead costs pag high yung production sa mga seasonal period na to. Yan. So, better kung i-apply natin siya evenly all throughout the year. Yan. Para ma-set natin siya agad kung ano ba yung mga kakailanganin natin na materials kapag dumating na yung mga bare months natin. Para hindi magahol ang management in estimating the right materials to purchase, yan. In estimating the right volume of units that they need to produce for that certain month. Yan. So para may enough stock yung company. And yun, as to selection of the overhead basis naman, normally, yun, management naman yung in charge in the selection process of the overhead basis kung magno-normal costing sila. And itong three factors na na-mention dito, yung usual consideration ng management. And unang-una dyan, syempre dapat hindi ganun ka-complex yung computation ng overhead basis natin. Yan. If you're familiar, no, I think na-mention ko naman to ng mga ilang meetings natin na there is a specific position talaga for cost accountant and there is a separate private certifications by to cost accountant. Yan, meron tayong mga registered cost accountant na internationally recognized yung certification. Yan. That's why very specialized din in nature ng cost accounting practices natin. So, yun. May mga cost accounting computation kasi na very complex talaga. Pero yun, nagiging complex lang talaga yung computation on the costing kapag sobrang high na or super voluminous ng transactions ng company and they have a lot of products na pinoproduce. Yan. Madaming variety with their products. Yan. Isa sa mga factor yun kung bakit nagiging complex yung cost accounting process natin. And yun, another factor in selecting the overhead basis would be the basis must be one that can easily be measured on each job. And syempre yung identifiable dun sa certain job if naka-job order costing yung cost accumulation nila para they could charge it directly to the work in process account. And syempre, the relationship pa din on the on our direct relationship pa din between overhead costs and the valuation basis na gagamitin natin. Ayan. So, for the recording of the manufacturing overhead costs, yan. So, ito yung magiging pro forma entry natin. Yan. So, if this is attributable to a certain job, technically we'll be applying the job order concept. Yan. And normally, we need to debit for the certain work in process and credit the manufacturing overhead controllers to record kung ano ba yung i-apply natin na manufacturing overhead costs based on our predetermined computation. Yan. And kaya kung mapapansin nyo, kung gagawa nyo siya ng T-account, yung manufacturing overhead natin, di ba normally, yung nasa debit or nasa left side ng T-account natin for the manufacturing overhead control, yun yung mga actual overhead costs natin. And yung mga nasa credit, usually yun yung applied manufacturing overhead natin. And yun, if nagkakaroon tayo ng difference na minsan mas malaki yung overhead applied, yung mas malaki yung actual versus applied overhead natin, so nagkakaroon tayo ng variances. Ayan. And for the variances, ayan, so we'll have more of it on our variance analysis portion. And pero para reference nyo na din, ano ba yung nagiging proforma entry natin for the under application or over application of overhead cost. Yan, so we'll have a debit if under applied, meaning mas malaki. Pag under applied, mas malaki yung actual costs natin as compared to the applied overhead cost. Yan, kaya under applied siya. So kapag ganun, we need to debit under applied manufacturing overhead and credit to the manufacturing overhead control. And opposite naman siya kapag meron tayong over application. And normally, itong mga variances due to predetermined overhead cost, ang ginagawang charging dito ng management is either i-allocate nila yung variance na yon sa mga accounts na to, either sa work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. Yan. Yung iba naman, directly to work in process lang ina-allocate. Yan. So, hindi na ako magdi-deal in masyado sa part na to, no? Para, yan, we'll have more of this naman sa variance analysis pa natin. Ayun. And then for the financial statements presentation naman natin, ayan, if there will be any under-applied or over-applied ng overhead costs during the period. So normally, in most cases naman, no, after siya ng cost of goods sold natin, yung presentation on the under-applied and over-applied overhead costs. Yan. Yun. And just for reference na din, so we'll discuss this more on our variance analysis. Pero relating to our overhead costs, I want to introduce yung two ways on getting the variances. So we have the volume variance and spending variance. Ayan. So if we are going to analyze this particular problem, ayan, for this particular illustration. So, normally, sa mga problems naman, given yung mga overhead costs natin yan. So, lalaroin nyo lang talaga siya. So, parang ang strong foundation for cost accounting problems talaga is still the concept. Yan. Na basta alam nyo yung concept, it would be easy for you to answer any cost accounting related problems. Yan. So, for this particular, no, for this particular example, meron tayong under-applied overhead. Yan. And dyan. So, hindi ko na pala siya discuss thoroughly. So, ano na lang natin to, sa variance analysis portion natin. Para hindi na rin kayo ma-confuse since hindi ko rin naman i-include ang normal costing sa midterm examination natin. Siguro konting curious lang since na-discuss naman natin siya. Pero on the problem computation, very limited lang naman. Ayan, so i-end ko na lang muna, no, for dito sa part na to, itong lecture natin for the accounting for overhead costs. And yun, if you have any questions, feel free to message me or sa group chat natin. And yun, thank you so much everyone for watching this video.